Have you ever heard a name so powerful that it could make men tremble with just a whisper? In the world of organized crime, there are many names that command fear: Luciano, Genovese, Gotti, but one name stood above them all: Gambino. Carlo Gambino wasn't just another mobster, he was the undisputed king of the American underworld. Unlike the reckless gangsters who lived fast and died young, Gambino was different. He played the long game. He moved in silence, struck with precision, and never let his enemies see him coming. For decades, his power stretched across New York like a shadow. Judges, politicians, businessmen, they all knew who he was. They all knew that if Carlo Gambino wanted something, it was his. No one crossed him and lived to talk about it. But how did he get there? How did a quiet, unassuming boy from a small Sicilian town rise to rule one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history? This is the story of Carlo Gambino, the man, the myth, the mastermind. And by the time we reach the end, you might be asking yourself, did he really die in peace? Or did he win the game before anyone else knew they were playing? To understand Gambino, you have to go back to the birthplace of the Mafia. Sicily in the early 20th century was a land of two things: tradition and crime. The island had been ruled by foreign powers for centuries, from the Spanish to the French, and with every new ruler came new oppression. The Sicilian Mafia Cosa Nostra was born out of necessity, a shadow government to protect the people, or at least that's what they claimed. In reality, the Mafia was built on fear, loyalty, and blood. And Carlo Gambino, he was born right into the center of it. His family was deeply connected to the Mafia, meaning he didn't just learn the rules of the game, he was raised by them. From an early age, he was taught the codes of honor, the value of silence, and the cost of betrayal. But was Carlo always meant to be a leader? Not necessarily. In Sicily, not everyone rises to power. You have to take it. Gambino understood this even as a child. Unlike other boys his age who dreamed of farming, fishing, or escaping to America for a better life, Carlo's dreams were darker. By the time he was old enough to understand the world, he had already seen violence, retribution, and power plays that would break most men. But Gambino didn't flinch. He absorbed every lesson, every betrayal, every execution, knowing that one day his time would come. And when it did, he wouldn't hesitate. Most kids spend their teenage years learning who they are. Carlo Gambino? By the time he was barely a teenager, he was already making a name for himself in the underworld. But let's pause for a second. What does that even mean? When we hear about teenage criminals, we think of petty theft, gang fights, or small-time smuggling. That wasn't Gambino. He wasn't some reckless thug trying to prove himself on the streets. He was cold, calculating, and most importantly, invisible. At a young age, Gambino was already trusted with smuggling operations, extortion schemes, and enforcing his family's will. But there's one thing the Mafia valued more than anything: eliminating problems before they become threats. Did Carlo Gambino take his first life before he was even a man? There's no official record, no police files, no court cases. But if you ask the old-timers who knew him, they'll tell you the same thing: Gambino wasn't a man you disrespected, even as a kid. And that raises another question. What happens when a boy who learns to kill at a young age grows up? The answer? He takes over everything. What does the American dream mean to you? For most, it's about freedom, opportunity, and building a life from nothing. But for Carlo Gambino, it was about power. In the early 20th century, thousands of Sicilian immigrants arrived in America searching for a better future. Many of them came with nothing but a suitcase and a dream. But Gambino, he arrived with connections, a purpose, and a mission. At just 19 years old, he set foot in New York for the first time. But make no mistake, he wasn't just another immigrant hoping to make a name for himself. He was sent there. The Sicilian Mafia had already planted its roots in America, controlling the docks, the unions, and the neighborhoods where their people lived. They weren't just surviving in this new land, they were thriving. And with prohibition in full swing, the streets of New York weren't just paved with opportunity, they were soaked in untaxed, illegal liquor money. But there was a problem. The American Mafia was fractured, disorganized, and full of rivalries. There were the old bosses who ruled with iron fists, and then there were the young bloods, the ones who wanted to rewrite the rules and take what they believed was rightfully theirs. Gambino arrived at a crossroads. He was a newcomer in a city already ruled by criminals far more established than him. So how did he make his way to the top? Patience, precision, and an ability to align himself with the right people at the right time. If you think Gambino was some loud, trigger-happy thug, think again. He didn't come to America looking to prove himself with violence. He came to build something lasting, and he started exactly where the real money was. Let's get one thing straight: prohibition was the greatest gift the Mafia ever received. Think about it. When the United States government banned alcohol, they didn't stop people from drinking. They just handed control over to criminals. The demand for liquor didn't disappear, it exploded, and the only way to get it? Through men like Carlo Gambino. New York became a war zone of smugglers, bootleggers, and corrupt officials who all had one goal: control the flow of illegal alcohol and get rich doing it. And Gambino, he didn't waste a second. He quickly aligned himself with a powerful Sicilian faction that was already knee-deep in rum-running operations, speakeasies, and bribing politicians to look the other way. His specialty? Avoiding the spotlight. While other gangsters were making headlines for flashy hits and violent takeovers, Gambino was doing something far more dangerous. He was embedding himself into the Mafia's financial network. He wasn't just selling booze on the streets, he was overseeing entire shipping operations, bribing customs agents, and ensuring that thousands of barrels of illegal liquor flowed into the US without interference. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Gambino wasn't a boss yet, but he was already thinking like one. Most men in the Mafia saw prohibition as a way to make quick money. Gambino, he saw it as a long-term investment. He understood that money alone wouldn't make him powerful, but using money to build loyalty, that would. So instead of throwing his wealth around recklessly, he reinvested it building alliances, buying influence, and securing a future where he wouldn't just be another soldier in the Mafia. He would be the one giving the orders. But first, he had to survive one of the most brutal power struggles in Mafia history. Imagine New York in the late 1920s. The streets were overflowing with money, but they were also drenched in blood. Why? Because two powerful Mafia factions were at war, and only one side would survive. On one side was Joe, the boss Masseria, an old-school Mafia leader who ruled with violence, intimidation, and outdated traditions. On the other side, a rising faction of younger, more ambitious mobsters, led by Salvatore Maranzano, a man who had no patience for the old ways and wanted to rebuild the Mafia into a structured empire. And in the middle of it all, Carlo Gambino. Gambino wasn't a boss yet, but he was already playing his cards wisely. He watched, he listened, and when the time came, he picked the winning side. Unlike other young gangsters who wanted power fast, Gambino understood that real power came from patience. He aligned himself with the Maranzano faction, working behind the scenes as the war escalated. He didn't need to be in the front lines, he just needed to make sure that when the dust settled, he was standing next to the victor. And that's exactly what happened. In 1931, Joe Masseria was gunned down in a restaurant. Some say Lucky Luciano set him up. Others say it was a calculated move by several ambitious mobsters looking to remove the old guard. Either way, Masseria was out. And Maranzano? He took control. With Masseria gone, Maranzano declared himself the boss of all bosses, restructuring the Mafia into what we now know as the Five Families. And Gambino, he had proven himself, not through reckless violence, not through flashy killings, but through calculated loyalty, strategic alliances, and an understanding that true power doesn't come from how many men you kill, but from how many men are willing to die for you. He wasn't at the top yet, but his time was coming, and when it did, no one would see it coming. Gambino was now a respected figure in the underworld, but his journey was far from over. The next chapter of his story would involve betrayals, assassinations, and a silent takeover that would make him the most powerful boss in Mafia history. But before he could reach the top, there was one more obstacle in his way. And this time, the bloodshed was just getting started. In the world of organized crime, power comes at a cost. The problem? Most mobsters want it too fast. They get greedy, reckless, impatient, and that's why they don't last. Carlo Gambino, he played a different game. While other men fought, killed, and bragged about their status, Gambino moved in silence. He understood a crucial truth. Power isn't taken, it's earned in the shadows. And that's exactly how he climbed the ranks. By the late 1940s, he was already an underboss in one of the most powerful crime families in America. But here's the question: how did he rise without making enemies? Because no one saw him as a threat. While other mobsters made headlines for shootouts and flashy lifestyles, Gambino was building alliances, eliminating problems quietly, and making himself indispensable. His reputation? A man who got things done without drawing attention. But there was one problem. The boss of the Gambino family at the time was Albert Anastasia, one of the most feared men in Mafia history. And if Gambino wanted the top spot, Anastasia had to go. Now here's where things get bloody. Albert Anastasia wasn't just any boss, he was a legend. A man so violent, he was known as the Mad Hatter and the Lord High Executioner. Why? Because he ran Murder Inc., the Mafia's secret enforcement squad responsible for hundreds of contract killings. But his biggest flaw, he was unpredictable. Anastasia ruled through fear, but in the Mafia, there's a fine line between being feared and being a liability, and he had crossed it. His temper, his public outbursts, his violent paranoia, they were attracting too much attention from law enforcement. And for men like Gambino, attention was bad for business. So what happened next? A setup, a betrayal, a hit that would go down in Mafia history. It was the morning of October 25th, 1957. Anastasia walked into the barbershop at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan. He sat down, expecting a normal shave. He had no idea this would be his last morning alive. As he reclined in the chair, two masked gunmen stormed in. They didn't say a word. They didn't hesitate. They opened fire. Anastasia, confused, lunged at his attackers. But there was nothing there. Why? Because he was attacking their reflection in the barbershop mirror. Within seconds, he was riddled with bullets, slumped over in a pool of blood. By the time the shooters vanished, the once feared boss of the Gambino crime family was dead. So was Carlo Gambino behind it? No proof, no witnesses, just results. And what happened next? Gambino didn't celebrate. He didn't make a scene. He just stepped in and took the throne. After the Anastasia hit, the Gambino crime family needed a new leader. And who stepped in? Carlo Gambino. No fireworks, no bloodshed, No disputes. It was the smoothest power transition in Mafia history. Why? Because he had planned it that way. Gambino didn't need to fight for power. By the time Anastasia was gone, he had already won. His rivals were either on his payroll or too afraid to challenge him. His allies had already pledged loyalty. And the commissions, the governing body of the Mafia, approved his leadership without hesitation. He wasn't just another mob boss. He was the Mafia's silent ruler. And once he had the power, he never let go. For the next 2 decades, Carlo Gambino ran his empire with an iron grip, avoiding the mistakes that got other mobsters killed or imprisoned. No flashy suits, no reckless killings, no unnecessary risks. Instead, he built an underworld dynasty, one that controlled everything from illegal gambling to labor unions, from drug trafficking to Wall Street. And he did it without ever spending a single night in prison. That's the kind of power Gambino wielded, and no one saw it coming. But the real question is, how did he stay untouchable for so long? And what happened when someone finally tried to take him down? The next part of the story, it only gets darker. Here's the question: how did Carlo Gambino stay at the top without ever ending up behind bars like so many other mob bosses? The answer? Discipline. In the Mafia, the biggest threat to power isn't always the government, it's your own ego. Al Capone built a criminal empire, but his arrogance and recklessness got him locked up for tax evasion. John Gotti loved the spotlight, but it made him a target, and in the end, it cost him everything. Gambino, he was different. No flashy suits, no unnecessary violence, no headlines. While other mobsters flaunted their wealth, Gambino operated like a ghost, building his empire through illegal gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and extortion, all without attracting too much attention. His biggest money-making machine. The unions, dock workers, truckers, construction crews, he controlled them all. If you wanted to build in New York, you paid Gambino. If you wanted your cargo unloaded at the ports, you paid Gambino. And if you didn't, your business mysteriously burned down. Or worse, you disappeared. The beauty of his system, it was airtight. Gambino never touched drugs, never left a paper trail, never personally ordered a hit. He let others do the dirty work while he sat back and collected billions. And the most shocking part, he did all of this without spending a single night in prison. That's how you know he wasn't just another mob boss. He was the boss. By the 60s, Carlo Gambino wasn't just the boss of his crime family. He was the most powerful mafia leader in America. Every major business in New York understood one thing: you didn't do anything without Gambino's blessing. From construction to casinos, from trucking to shipping, he had a piece of everything. The city that never sleeps, the skyline built on steel and sweat. Most of it was funded, controlled, or taxed by Carlo Gambino. And if someone refused to play by his rules, they vanished. There were no warnings, no second chances. If Gambino decided you were a problem, you were gone before you even realized you were in danger. That's how complete his control was. And while politicians and businessmen pretended they didn't know who really ran the city behind closed doors, they all understood one thing: Carlo Gambino was untouchable. The government knew Gambino was pulling the strings, but they couldn't touch him. J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI were watching, tapping phones, following leads, but every time they thought they had something, it slipped right through their fingers. Why? Because Gambino controlled everything. He didn't just have loyal men in the streets, he had them in the courts, in law enforcement, in high places where decisions were made. He never used telephones to discuss business. He never signed anything. He never even directly ordered a murder. He simply made it clear who needed to disappear, and his men handled the rest. And unlike other mob bosses, he never let his guard down. The FBI raided homes, bugged meeting spots, arrested associates, but Gambino remained untouchable. They had evidence against his men, they had witnesses against his operations, but against Carlo Gambino himself, nothing. Most mob bosses live by fear. They rule through intimidation, and when their men sense weakness, they turn on them. Gambino, he ruled through something far more powerful: loyalty. He was smart, calculated, and rewarded those who served him well. He didn't make unnecessary enemies. He didn't kill for sport. He didn't run his organization like a dictatorship. He built a family not just in name, but in trust. His men respected him because he treated them well, and in return, they protected him at all costs. Unlike other mobsters who turned on each other when things got tough, Gambino's men would rather die than betray him. That's what made him unstoppable. There was only one time someone tried to take Carlo Gambino's life, and they failed. The year was 1972. By now, Gambino was at the height of his power. He had outlived rivals, avoided prison, and continued to expand his empire. But there was one problem: he wasn't the only one who wanted to be the most powerful boss in New York. One of his biggest rivals, Joe Colombo, had been making waves. He had built his own network of influence, even drawing public attention through the Italian-American Civil Rights League, and Gambino didn't like it. Colombo was loud, reckless, and putting too much heat on the Mafia. And in the world of organized crime, when you make too much noise, someone eventually decides to silence you. During a rally in Columbus Circle, Colombo was shot 3 times in front of a massive crowd. The message was clear, but Gambino wasn't done cleaning house. Later that year, a failed assassination attempt was made on him. The man behind it, Carmine the Cigar Galante, another powerful mafia figure who wanted to take Gambino out. But he made a mistake: he didn't finish the job. Gambino survived. And what happened next? His enemies vanished. Within a few years, Carmine Galante was gunned down in broad daylight while eating lunch, a cigar still hanging from his lips. That's the kind of power Gambino held. As Gambino aged, he knew one thing: power must be passed wisely. Too many bosses before him had built empires only to watch them crumble because they didn't plan for the future. And Gambino, he wasn't about to let that happen. He carefully chose his successor, Paul Castellano, a businessman-like mobster who he believed would keep the Gambino family thriving without making the same mistakes others had. But did he choose wisely? Many of the younger generation didn't respect Castellano. They saw him as weak, too focused on money, and not enough on enforcing power. And when Gambino died in 1976, the cracks in his empire started to show. His peaceful, calculated rule was over. And the next generation, they were about to throw everything he built into chaos. What happened next would lead to one of the most infamous mob murders in history. And it all started with a man named John Gotti. Most mob bosses don't get to choose how they die. They either get locked away for life, gunned down in the streets, or disappear without a trace. But Carlo Gambino, he died peacefully in his own home. No FBI takedown, no rival's bullet, no betrayal from within. For a man who had spent half a century controlling an empire built on crime, violence, and corruption, he managed to do what so many before him had failed to do: walk away on his own terms. On October 15, 1976, Gambino took his last breath in his Long Island mansion, surrounded by family. He had lived to the age of 74, outlasting nearly every major mobster of his time. But what did he leave behind? A dynasty. He didn't just build a crime family, he built a system, an institution that kept making money long after he was gone. His death wasn't the end of the Gambino family. Or was it? Because after Gambino, everything started to change. With Gambino gone, the question was who would take his place. And this is where the cracks began to show. Before his death, Gambino had handpicked Paul Castellano as his successor. On paper, it made sense. Castellano was a businessman, just like Gambino, and knew how to keep the family profitable without drawing too much attention. But there was a problem. Many of the younger generation hated Castellano. They saw him as soft, too focused on money, and not enough on enforcing power. And one man in particular was waiting for his moment to strike: John Gotti. Gotti was everything Gambino wasn't allowed: reckless and obsessed with fame. Where Gambino ruled from the shadows, Gotti wanted to be a celebrity. He flaunted his wealth, wore expensive suits, and loved seeing his name in the newspapers. And that was a mistake. Under Gambino, the Mafia had thrived because it stayed quiet. But under Gotti, the Mafia became a spectacle. In 1985, Gotti made his move. On December 16th, Castellano was gunned down in front of a Manhattan steakhouse in one of the most infamous mob hits in history. Gotti took control, but he had already sealed his fate. The moment the Mafia started making headlines, the government went to war. Gotti was arrested in 1990, convicted in 1992, and sentenced to life in prison. By the time the 20th century came to a close, the Mafia's golden age was over. But was the Mafia itself really gone? Gambino's life was proof of one thing: true power doesn't come from fear alone. It comes from patience, strategy, and control. While other mobsters built their legacies on violence and intimidation, Gambino built something bigger. He understood the long game. He knew that being feared wasn't enough, you had to be respected. And he knew that real power wasn't about making enemies, it was about making people dependent on you. That's why he lasted. That's why he won. He didn't just build an empire, he built a legacy. And even after his death, his influence didn't disappear. Because the Mafia, it wasn't gone, it was just evolving. Many people think the Mafia died out in the late 20th century, that it was crushed by the FBI, informants, and changing times. But is that really true? Or did it just go back to where it started, into the shadows? The five families still exist today. The Gambino family still exists today. They're not as flashy, not as reckless, not as powerful as they once were. But does that mean they're gone? Or have they simply adapted? Organized crime never disappears, it just changes its face. Today, the Mafia isn't making money the way they did in Gambino's era. Illegal gambling, drug trafficking, cybercrime, and money laundering have replaced the old rackets. And the most important rule still remains: silence is power. And that's exactly how Carlo Gambino would have wanted it. If Carlo Gambino were alive today, what would he think of the Mafia as it stands now? Would he respect the new generation for adapting, evolving, and staying under the radar? Or would he shake his head at the recklessness that led to the downfall of men like John Gotti? Would he admire the way the Mafia still finds ways to survive? Or would he see it as a ghost of what it once was? One thing is certain: the Mafia didn't die with Gambino. Maybe the faces have changed. Maybe the game has changed. Maybe the methods have changed. But the power struggles, the secrecy, the control over money and business, that never changes. And the story of Carlo Gambino, it isn't just about the past. It's about a way of life that still exists today. What do you think? Did Gambino's way of doing things die with him? Or is his influence still felt in the underworld today? Let me know in the comments because the Mafia's story is far from over.